A warm summer evening. A restaurant on the corner, known for its elite atmosphere, was filled with guests enjoying dinner in an air of luxury and calm. Elegant people sat at tables, while waiters moved silently between them, maintaining the peace and order of the place. A black couple entered the restaurant, and their arrival did not go unnoticed. The man was tall, dressed in a sharp black suit, a white shirt, and a tie. The woman, slender and graceful, wore an elegant dress with a neat hairstyle and subtle makeup. They walked in confidently, not trying to hide. The couple made their way to a free table in the center of the room, visible to everyone. Several other tables remained empty, and the man effortlessly began pulling out a chair for the woman. But then their attention was drawn to a waiter standing by the counter, who immediately walked toward them. His face was cold, with a faint expression of disdain. "Excuse me," the waiter said, crossing his arms. "This table is not for you." The man froze, unable to believe his ears. He tried to understand what was happening. "Why?" he asked, pointing to the empty tables around them. "This table is free." The waiter glanced at the tables and then turned his gaze back to the couple. "This table is not for you," he repeated with visible irritation. "Please wait by the door." The woman felt a tightness in her chest. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was an insult. She couldn't understand why they weren't being served. The man tried to clarify. "Why are you refusing to serve us? We see the tables are free." His voice had grown more assertive, but not aggressive. The waiter, still crossing his arms, responded dismissively. "I said you should wait by the door." The woman felt the growing anger inside her. She was trying to hold it back, but the tension was rising with every word from the waiter. The man, noticing her reaction, could feel his patience starting to wear thin. He tried to remain calm, but knew they couldn't let this slide. "We're not going to wait by the door like we're some kind of second-class people," she said, her voice becoming firm. "We came here to eat, not to wait for scraps." The waiter merely shook his head, but didn't speak. He didn't back down. The couple stood there, scanning the room. The whole restaurant seemed to fall silent. The other diners exchanged looks, but no one intervened. At that moment, the man felt the atmosphere of the restaurant turning against them. The people, who moments ago seemed to enjoy their meals, were now watching, but not a single one of them stood up to help. It was as if they had all decided to ignore the injustice happening in front of them. "I don't understand what's going on," the man said, looking the waiter in the eye. "We're not breaking any rules. Why can't we just sit here and eat?" The waiter, still not looking him in the eye, repeated, "I told you, you need to wait by the entrance." The woman glanced at the man, their eyes meeting. She could feel the sting of humiliation and anger, and she knew it wasn't just about the refusal to serve them. It was about being treated like they didn't belong here, like they were invisible. The man clenched his fists. He knew the moment had arrived. They couldn't back down. He spoke again, his voice now carrying authority. "We're staying," he said. "If you're not going to serve us, we'll wait right here." The waiter only smirked but said nothing. His earlier confidence had vanished. His eyes showed uncertainty. At that moment, someone in the crowd started recording the incident on their phone. The restaurant became more and more uncomfortable. The man and woman remained seated. They weren't leaving. The tension grew with each passing second. The people in the room now realized that this was more than a simple dispute over a table. It was a clash of realities, a battle for dignity. The waiter, sensing the situation was slipping out of control, looked around nervously. The couple stood firm. Their stance was clear. They wouldn't be pushed around. "We're not leaving," the woman said, her voice resolute. "We won't be silenced when we're being humiliated." The man held her hand tightly, standing confidently beside her. They didn't know how the night would end, but one thing was clear. They weren't leaving without a fight. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone could feel it. The couple was standing their ground, while the waiter and the other guests quietly watched. The struggle wasn't just about a meal, it was a fight for their right to be treated with respect. And so, the scene played out, with every eye in the room focused on the couple. The waiter seemed to realize that this was no longer just about serving food. It was about something much bigger. And the couple, they were determined to stay and be heard. The entire restaurant had fallen into silence. The air was thick with tension, and every guest in the room seemed to hold their breath, unsure of how to respond. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one dared intervene. Some gripped their cutlery tighter, hoping their silence might somehow influence the situation. The man and woman sat still, their eyes fixed on the waiter. His confidence had completely faded. No longer the cold and impassive figure he once was, he now seemed uncertain and nervous. Yet he couldn't back down. His pride and duty kept him standing firm. He stepped back, then returned to his previous stance. "I told you, you need to wait by the door," the waiter repeated, his voice weaker than before. He adjusted his tie nervously, aware of the growing tension but unable to change his stance. The couple remained unmoving, their resolve unwavering. Meanwhile, one of the guests in the far corner of the restaurant took out his phone and started recording the incident. The woman saw this and clenched her fists, but she stayed in her seat. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed the simmering anger inside her. She knew she had to hold herself with dignity, despite the humiliation. Time dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. Every glance, every attempt to return to normalcy was weighed down by fear and anxiety. The man could feel his patience thinning, not knowing how much longer they could endure this. This wasn't just about a table, it was a clash of two realities, one where people felt entitled to power and another where they fought to preserve their dignity. A few minutes later, another waiter approached the counter and whispered something to the first. The man noticed and immediately focused his attention on the new arrival. He could feel that something was about to change, that the situation was escalating. "Would you like to order something?" the new waiter asked, his tone more neutral but still tense. It was clear he had been forced to step in, unsure of how to defuse the situation. The man didn't respond right away. He looked at the woman, and they exchanged a silent understanding. They both knew that if they gave in now, they would never be able to return to this moment. This was more than just about food. It was about asserting their right to be there, to be treated equally. They were not going to back down. "No," the man said, his voice steady as he returned his gaze to the waiter. "We won't order anything until we're served properly." The waiter stepped back, clearly rattled. He fell silent, his discomfort palpable. The guests around him began to gather, but no one spoke. The tension in the air continued to mount, and everyone knew the situation could spiral out of control at any moment. At that moment, a man from a nearby table stood up and walked over to the waiter. His face was expressionless, but there was a barely concealed anger in his eyes. He addressed the waiter, his voice firm. "Maybe you didn't notice, but all people here are equal. Why are you treating them this way?" The waiter, taken aback by the confrontation, lowered his gaze. The man didn't give him a chance to respond, continuing to speak. "If you can't treat them with respect, maybe you should leave," he said, his words cutting through the silence. The couple exchanged a glance, and in that brief moment their resolve strengthened. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had ever faced such injustice. The waiter, realizing he was losing control, lowered his head for a moment, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He took a step back, but the damage had been done. Then a group of people, who had been quietly watching, gathered near the couple. One of them, a young man, spoke up, his voice low but resolute. "If you won't serve people because of their skin color, maybe you shouldn't work here." His words rippled through the room. The tension in the restaurant deepened, but now it was charged with anticipation. Some guests whispered to one another, while others pulled out their phones, recording the moment. The woman felt the pressure building, knowing that this was a pivotal moment. She remained composed, but inside, her heart raced. In response to the growing silence, she stood up and addressed the waiter. "We're not leaving until we're served like everyone else." At that moment, the situation reached a boiling point. A confrontation was inevitable, and someone had to make the first move. The tension in the restaurant was palpable, and the once silent guests now fidgeted in their seats, some nervously glancing toward the couple. The waiter, once confident, now seemed uncertain. His composure had broken, and it was clear that he was struggling to maintain control over the situation. The man and woman at the table exchanged glances. This moment was crucial. They had to hold firm. Their silence was their strength. It was a message to everyone in the restaurant that they would not tolerate injustice. They were ready for whatever came next. Then, an older man from a nearby table stood up. His hair was graying, but his eyes burned with determination. He walked toward the waiter and spoke in a firm but controlled voice. "This isn't right. Why aren't you serving this couple?" The waiter turned to him, avoiding eye contact. He opened his mouth, but couldn't find the words to explain himself. "I don't want to get involved, but you can't treat people like this," the older man continued. "This is a restaurant, not your personal space to humiliate people. We're all human here." The couple remained still, but their eyes were filled with quiet resolve. They had been humiliated enough, and they would not let this moment slip away without standing their ground. As the older man spoke, a few more guests started to murmur among themselves. Tension built with every passing second. The restaurant was no longer just a place for dining. It had become a battleground for dignity. The waiter, clearly flustered, tried to shake off the pressure but was failing. His resolve had shattered, but he couldn't back down. He stepped back and muttered weakly, "I won't serve you if you stay here." The man stood up. The room grew eerily quiet as all eyes turned toward him. He was determined. This was no longer about food. It was about respect and equality. He walked toward the waiter, his every step filled with purpose. He leaned in and said with quiet authority, "What did you say? Are you serious? We're not leaving. If you won't serve us, we'll stay here as long as we have to." The waiter looked helpless, his gaze darting from one guest to another, but he was alone. The pressure was mounting. He could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on him. He was being watched, judged, and there was no escape. A young man, seated near the couple, stood up and moved toward the waiter. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of anger that cut through the room. You can't just ignore them because of their skin color. You have to treat them with respect. Others in the restaurant began to take notice, rising from their tables and gathering around the couple. It was clear that the situation was no longer just about two people. It was about everyone who had ever faced discrimination, everyone who had suffered in silence. One woman in the back corner of the restaurant spoke up. "This is unacceptable. We need to stand for what's right." The waiter, already rattled, looked around in desperation for support, but none came. His confidence was gone. He had lost control of the situation, and he knew it. A man from a nearby table joined in. "If you can't serve them, maybe you shouldn't be working here." His words hung in the air, and the restaurant fell into a tense silence. The tension was unbearable now, the silence charged with anticipation. The waiter could barely stand, his hands shaking. The woman, feeling the weight of the moment, stood up and faced him. Her voice was calm but firm. "We're not leaving until we're treated like everyone else." The room held its breath. The waiter, defeated, dropped his gaze and finally said, barely above a whisper, "Fine, I'll serve you." But the damage was already done. It wasn't just about the meal. It was about standing up, refusing to be pushed aside, and making a stand against the injustice that had taken place. The couple's resolve had changed the dynamic of the room. They had shown that even in the face of humiliation, they would not be silenced. The restaurant remained tense, but the moment had passed. The waiter had relented, but the fight for dignity and respect would continue long after the meal had ended. The moment the waiter left, the tension in the restaurant didn't dissipate. The atmosphere remained thick, like the calm before a storm. The guests, who had been silent moments before, now shifted nervously in their seats. Every breath, every glance seemed charged with questions, but no one dared to speak, even when the waiter returned with the dishes. He set them down, but it was clear he didn't believe what was happening. The couple sat still, their faces calm but determined. The silence between them spoke volumes. This was no longer just about food, it was about dignity. They wouldn't let this moment slip by without standing their ground. The waiter quickly walked away, but the tension didn't leave with him. It hung thick in the air, suffocating. The guests glanced nervously between the couple and each other. It was as if everyone knew this moment was bigger than just a misunderstanding. It was a moment that demanded attention. Just then, the older man who had stood up earlier walked over. He felt that the situation wasn't resolved and wasn't willing to let it go unnoticed. His eyes burned with the need for change, and there was also concern for those who had stayed silent. "We need to talk," he said, sitting down beside them. "I can't just sit here knowing things like this are happening. This isn't an isolated incident, it's a lesson for all of us." The woman and man exchanged a glance. There was something in his words that made them realize they weren't alone. They hadn't expected this support, but in that moment it felt like a sign. This was bigger than them. It was about standing together. As the older man spoke, a loud noise came from the entrance. A young couple with children walked in. Their discomfort was immediately clear, and they made no attempt to hide their disdain. They spoke openly, loudly, with clear prejudice. "Why is this couple still here?" the young man said, glaring at the couple. "They don't belong here." The words echoed in the restaurant, adding to the tension. The woman felt her anger rise but kept her composure. Her face remained calm, her eyes icy. She understood the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just an insult. It was a challenge, and she would not back down. The man stood. The room grew quiet as everyone turned to him. His presence was commanding, and he walked toward the young man with purpose. The confrontation was inevitable. "Are you serious?" the man said, his voice cold. "Do you really want to continue this?" The young man hesitated, but his gaze didn't waver. He wanted to challenge the couple, but something in the man's voice made him step back. The tension in the room grew, but the couple remained unwavering. The young couple walked away, but their words hung in the air. It was clear that the discomfort wasn't over. Their departure didn't ease the situation. It only highlighted the prejudices they had openly displayed. The older man returned to their table. His face was serious, his eyes full of concern. "I'm afraid that's not enough," he said quietly. "If we don't do more, this will keep happening. We need to act. We can't just sit back and hope it'll change." His words resonated deeply with the couple. They now realized that this wasn't just about them. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been discriminated against, about showing that silence would no longer be tolerated. But as they prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. A man in plain clothes entered the restaurant. His presence was immediate, and everyone felt it. Though he wasn't in uniform, it was clear he had authority. He approached the couple's table, his demeanor calm but firm. "Excuse me," he said. "I need to speak with you. I'm a private security officer, and there's an incident here I can't ignore." The room fell silent. His words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. The couple exchanged wary glances, unsure of what to make of this new development. The moment the waiter left, the tension in the restaurant didn't fade. The atmosphere remained thick, like the calm before a storm. The guests, who had been silent moments before, now shifted nervously in their seats. Every breath, every glance seemed charged with questions, but no one dared to speak. The waiter returned with the dishes, but it was clear he didn't believe what was happening. The couple sat still, their faces calm but determined. The silence between them spoke volumes. This was no longer just about food, it was about dignity. They wouldn't let this moment slip by without standing their ground. The waiter quickly walked away, but the tension didn't leave with him. It hung in the air, suffocating. The guests glanced nervously between the couple and each other. It was as if everyone knew this moment was bigger than just a misunderstanding. It was a moment that demanded attention. Just then, the older man who had stood up earlier walked over. He felt that the situation wasn't resolved and wasn't willing to let it go unnoticed. His eyes burned with the need for change. "We need to talk," he said, sitting down beside them. "I can't just sit here, knowing things like this are happening. This isn't an isolated incident, it's a lesson for all of us." The woman and man exchanged a glance. There was something in his words that made them realize they weren't alone. They hadn't expected this support, but in that moment, it felt like a sign. This was bigger than them. It was about standing together. As the older man spoke, a loud noise came from the entrance. A young couple with children walked in, their discomfort immediately apparent. They spoke openly, loudly, with clear prejudice. "Why is this couple still here?" the young man said, glaring at them. "They don't belong here." The words echoed in the restaurant, adding to the tension. The woman felt her anger rise but kept her composure. Her face remained calm, her eyes icy. This wasn't just an insult, it was a challenge, and she would not back down. The man stood. The room grew quiet as everyone turned to him. His presence was commanding, and he walked toward the young man with purpose. The confrontation was inevitable. "Are you serious?" the man said, his voice cold. "Do you really want to continue this?" The young man hesitated, but his gaze didn't waver. He wanted to challenge the couple, but something in the man's voice made him step back. The tension in the room grew, but the couple remained unwavering. The young couple walked away, but their words hung in the air. The discomfort wasn't over. Their departure didn't ease the situation. It only highlighted their prejudice. The older man returned to their table, his face serious, eyes full of concern. "I'm afraid that's not enough," he said quietly. "If we don't do more, this will keep happening. We need to act. We can't just sit back and hope it'll change." His words resonated deeply with the couple. They now realized that this wasn't just about them. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been discriminated against, about showing that silence would no longer be tolerated. But as they prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. A man in plain clothes entered the restaurant. His presence was immediate, and everyone felt it. Though he wasn't in uniform, it was clear he had authority. He approached the couple's table, his demeanor calm but firm. "Excuse me," he said. "I need to speak with you. I'm a private security officer, and there's an incident here I can't ignore." The room fell silent. His words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. The couple exchanged wary glances, unsure of what to make of this new development. The tension in the restaurant thickened, and the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. The couple sat, their faces calm but determined. Every guest seemed to feel it, shifting uneasily, waiting for something to break the silence. The waiter had returned, his disbelief evident, but the couple stayed quiet. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about standing their ground. The waiter quickly retreated, but the unease in the air remained. People exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared intervene. Then, the older man who had been watching from the sidelines approached them. His voice was low, but his words carried strength. "This can't be ignored. It's not just your fight. It's for all of us." The woman and man exchanged a look. This wasn't just their battle anymore. They weren't alone. The older man's support gave them strength, a sign that they weren't fighting this injustice by themselves. But just as they began to process his words, the door opened, and a young couple with children walked in. The woman could immediately sense the discomfort in the air. They made no attempt to hide their prejudice. "Why are they still here?" The young man's voice rang out across the room, his eyes fixed on the couple. "They don't belong." The words cut through the atmosphere, and the woman's blood boiled. But she held herself together, her composure unwavering. She wasn't just going to let this pass. She wasn't going to back down. The man stood up. The room went quiet as all eyes turned toward him. His presence was commanding as he walked toward the young man. The confrontation was inevitable. "Are you serious?" The man's voice was cold. "Do you want to keep this up?" The young man hesitated. For a moment he was unsure, but his gaze didn't waver. He wasn't going to back down either. The tension hung in the air, thick and heavy, but the couple stayed firm. The young couple eventually walked away, but the discomfort remained. Their departure didn't ease the situation. It made the prejudice even clearer. The older man returned to their table. His face was grave, his concern palpable. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "If we don't act now, it will just keep happening. We can't sit back and hope it'll change." His words hit home for the couple. They knew now that this wasn't just about them. It was about standing up for everyone. It was about making a stand for justice, for dignity. As they prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. A man in plain clothes entered the restaurant, and the room felt his presence instantly. Though he wasn't wearing a uniform, it was clear that he had authority. He approached their table, calm yet firm. "I need to speak with you," he said. "I'm a private security officer, and I'm here because of the situation." The room went silent. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The couple exchanged uncertain glances. Who was this man, and what did he want? The older man, sensing the growing tension, took a step back, his concern shifting to the couple. The situation was quickly becoming more complicated. Before the couple could respond, 2 more men in civilian clothes entered the restaurant. Their arrival was commanding, their faces cold. They moved toward the table without hesitation, further heightening the anxiety in the air. One of them looked at the older man, his voice sharp. "This is none of your business. Step aside." The older man opened his mouth to protest but remained silent, sensing the danger in the air. His gaze turned to the couple. This was their fight now. The couple stayed resolute, their posture unyielding. They weren't backing down. One of the new men addressed them directly. "Do you have anything to say?" His voice was cold and dismissive. The woman felt the weight of the words, but she stood firm, her expression steely. They weren't intimidated. They had come too far to be silenced now. Just as the tension reached its peak, a woman from the back of the room stood up and walked over. She had been quietly observing, but now her voice cut through the room. "I don't care who you are," she said, her tone firm, directed at the security officers. "This isn't right. You can't let this happen. Not here." Her words seemed to ignite something in the room. The couple felt a surge of support. They weren't alone. People were beginning to speak up. The power of the moment was shifting. Before anything else could unfold, a man walked in, his presence immediate. The room grew still, every eye turning to him. The tension, once suffocating, became palpable. But it wasn't just about this moment anymore. It was about standing together, taking a stand. The couple, now with new allies, stood up to leave. They walked out of the restaurant, but their steps were heavy with meaning. This was no longer just about food or a table. It was about standing for what was right. As they left, the room remained silent, but there was a shift. People began to rea.